The vote is 16-16 in Euros Council. The casting vote is with the council president. Can you guess how the council president votes? So I made it a personal vendetta to beat each and every single adjudicator who voted against us in the subsequent years. I have managed to deliver on my vendetta. A belief that I am so much better than anyone else. It was more the belief that their thinking was not particularly intelligent.
All right, Siri, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Nikki.
Let's see, European champion twice, ESL Open, World Semis, I believe. A bunch of stuff in debating. We can talk about that a little bit later, but for the young kids out there, pretty good debater. You have pretty good ESL debaters. One of the first ESL debaters to have major recognition onto the international scene. We can talk about that, but generally happy to have you, happy to have your experience, and also have a fun chat. So, as always, I start with how do you feel?
Pretty good. I'm well slept. Had a relatively light day, so I'm in a chatty mood right now.
Perfect, perfect. So, I wanted to start with a funny story. So, tell me about this novice tournament that you have in Serbia that is every December, I believe, and you can only do it once.
All right, it's called Decembarat, which I guess in translation means December tournament. So yes, you only do it as a fresher. Like in Serbia, especially when I started, we didn't have we practically didn't have a school circuit, only a uni circuit. So for most people, myself included, start of uni year, which happens in early October, would be their first introduction to the concept of a debate speech. So the tournament would be pretty much a level playing field, as more or less everyone only had about eight weeks or so of debate workshops, and I was participating at it in 2011, 2012. Uh, Reached the finals. I was speaking with Helena Ivanov, with whom I also spoke afterwards for the following 4 years. We reached the finals. We lost to a team that was good, but the call was incorrect. It was a 4-3 split decision. Took them about 3 hours and 15 minutes of deliberation. If you have done any judging, you will know how much people remember from their flow after 3 hours and 15 minutes versus how much they're reading into their notes. So I made it a personal vendetta to beat each and every single adjudicator who voted against us in the subsequent years. I have managed to deliver on my vendetta. I think that especially in my early years, that was a recurring theme within Serbian debating. There were people I had grudges against, and I would try my best to beat them. By the end of it, like the people I had grudges against, I was able to defeat them all. But this is also as a result of the fact that they were all older than me and started debating earlier than I did. So consequently, like in terms of Serbian debating, it was not very strong prior to the generation which Helena and I, but also some other pretty good speakers like Ilya Ivanišević were part of. So that made it a bit easier. But yes, that is the long and short story of it. We got ripped off in a call in the finals. I still remember it. I don't entirely remember the exact wording of the motion anymore, but I even remember the four teams who were in the debate.
So, as you said, is this your main debate motivator throughout the years in terms of getting revenge against people? I mean, obviously, you like particular parts of the game, but it's an exhausting hobby. So, what kept you going?
Um, it was not vendetta. It was not vendetta going throughout my years. So to give a bit of context, Serbian debating at that point in time was not particularly good. And part of the reason it was not good, there's a number of reasons. Like I can discuss this ad nauseum. You can make a podcast just about this. But one of the reasons why it wasn't very good was because people just had the wrong way of thinking about arguments and about how you structure things and what you're like, what a debating speech essentially should look like. So, consequently, when from that perspective, someone gives me a third when they ought to have given me a win, I get pretty annoyed. It's like, look, we've all been on the receiving side of calls that were not ideal, but I think you will also recognize like there are times where you can objectively understand why you're first or second, but then there are times when you get given an idiotic call and it is justified for idiotic reasons. So it wasn't so much like at that point in time a belief that I am so much better than anyone else. It was more the belief that their thinking was not particularly intelligent. So that definitely drove me in the years while I was doing Serbian debating. So, which was, I would say, actively the 2011 to 2013 period. I was doing a lot of local debating, many of which was in the Serbian language. 2013 onwards, I was more established and was predominantly doing international competitions. I think there, to be perfectly honest, so like in terms of my lifespan in debating, I've actively spoken from end of 2011 and until summer of 2016 when I did my last Euros. I did a bit on and off stuff, but that wasn't really serious. And I did a lot of active judging in 2017. I've more or less taken a much more low profile role after that. I show up occasionally. So vendetta can't really drive you for 7 years. It did drive me for the first 2, 3. I think after that, it was pure competitive spirit. So there's a number of reasons why people do debating. For me, it's just like I really like to compete. I like the thrill of the competition. I like the suspense of the rounds, particularly if they're closed. And I do ultimately like the achievements. I mean, the added bonuses were you meet some interesting people. You learn about topics you would have not known about otherwise. And you also get to travel to some relatively cool places. I still deeply regret that I was never able to come to Pazarchik, but that was due to visa issues back then.
Yeah, that was a interesting competition to say the least. So
I'm
just
sure.
taking you back a little bit, was the allure of international competitions? I think that was at least how I saw it. It's kind of a bigger stage to prove also to your local community that you've got it, especially if you are experiencing certain like problems within that particular community. I mean, it's always great to be part of your local community, but in terms of competitiveness, it can get stale. It can get also sometimes you're just frustrated that it's hard to have, like, for example, a very good judge pool at
Yeah.
prominent debate competitions, especially when you're developing your society.
Agreed. Like, I mean, look, if I think about it, right? Initially, it was like, oh, this seems like a fun activity, a good pastime from school. So let's do it. Then it became like, let's get amongst the best in Serbia. And I think like after a year or so, we were probably the best in our cohort. After 2 years, we definitely were. We were possibly the best amongst the best in the country, if not the best. So then obviously there's like the allure of something international. But the other part is like on this point you reference. I thought the way we judged and thought about debating back then when I was a second year was just fundamentally wrong. And I thought the best way to prove that is go outside where there are good judges. If you show a track record there, like people cannot argue against results. If people from 5 different countries think I win and you think I did not, it's more likely the problem is with you, not with not with them and not with me. So that was the driver back then. But yeah, I mean, also like you go to nice places. Like I'm not sure if they still have it, but like there was still, like, I remember like Paris Open, you got a bottle of wine per room per round, and then it was particularly good if you make it to the top room because the other teams are taking it seriously, so they don't want to drink. So it's essentially a bottle of wine for your team.
Yeah, definitely. So, which were the biggest rivals? The people who you really wanted to beat, apart from the people from that particular debate, maybe from in the international debating community.
Yeah, so internationally speaking, uh, look, when I was progressing, there was a big gap between EPL and ESL speakers. Part of this was objectively there. Part of it, this was due to bias. This is a topic people have discussed ad nauseum, so I've like no need to go further into that one. So there were people you looked up to, like 2012, like there were people like Harish Natarajan, Jack Watson. There were other teams there. There was Tom Hosking, etc. But these you looked as ideals. You would never get as good as them. If you end up in a room with them, you'll just quickly go back to the lower part of the table. So in terms of where we landed, um, at, during the first part when we became a good ESL team, which I would say is 2014 onwards. So as you pointed out, in 2014 we won Euros in ESL. We also reached the ESL finals in Chennai, which was 8 months prior. So that's the point where you could say, based on results, we've become a quote unquote good team. At that point, our biggest rivals were Lund, who had a very good team. Per now Yellendorf and Emilia Karlquist. Um, there were also Kai Dittman and Desislava Kirova who won Chennai Worlds in ESL. Desi was also the DCA of Manchester Euros the year before. I don't think they were as good as Lund. And the common understanding at that point in time was that we were the two best ESL teams in Europe by a country mile. At that point in time, Israel was going through a bit of a change of generation. So Omer and Sela were not active anymore. There were a few decent speakers like Alon Wandam or Ben Gladnikov, but they were not at the level people before them were. And then towards the latter part of my debating, my active speaking, Lahav and Ayal became a thing. Uh, Now, admittedly, I have not seen them at their full prime, which I understand was in 2018. At that point, I was already out. But towards the time I was in the later stages of my debating career, they were definitely a top rival. And then when MDG and myself were preparing for Warsaw Euros in 2016, we considered them our top competition to win the competition to win the tournament. But yeah, we were fortunate enough that they got knocked out in the quarters.
Yeah, there seems to be a thing with good Israeli teams getting knocked out at open quarters of Euros.
Yeah,
Happened this last year as well.
yeah.
Um,
I have a perspective on that, but yes, I know it happens with them. And also it also happened with some other very very good teams like MDG and Ashish got kicked out of Malaysia World quarters, despite being, I think, by far the best team in that competition during the end rounds.
so why do you think that happens?
Mm, So, if like, I mean, for the record, like I have immense respect for Israeli debating. I have particularly high respect for Dan Lahav and Ayal, who I assume at their prime were absolutely top notch. Uh, Dan is most likely more than anyone else the best ESL debater of all time, and you can make the argument that he is overall the best of all time. Um, I think the way they ran cases, at least during the time I was active, was a lot of nuance, a lot of framing, but sometimes the argumentation would either not have the knowledge to back it up. So they were logically very good, but sometimes they lacked content. this isn't a problem in and of itself purely because you cannot add context and detail to arguments, but also because there are certain topics you might not know as well. You every now and then can run a case that is completely insane. Issue with that being, especially if you think about worlds, right? Worlds, you have to make it through 4 out rounds successfully in order to win it. 5 if you don't make the top 16 teams. All you're away from, like everything that separates you from like complete failure is one crazy case. And I think every now and then they could run a case which isn't entirely sensible. I mean, this being said, of course, like superlatives and other stuff apply, analysis, framing, etc., big impact on debating as well. But yeah, occasionally there will be the really freakish case. I think if I contrast that with myself, I was I was never as good as analytically, perhaps, not as good in framing, definitely. But very rarely ran things which people would characterize as completely insane. I think that's also part of the reason why I tended to do good in out rounds and why I reached the finals of almost in every competition I spoke at.
Fair enough. Fair enough. You put it in the most humble way that you can put it, which is fair enough. Um, so that's interesting. I think this leads me to like the bigger question here, and you kind of mentioned it already. So currently, you have a lot of good ESL debaters. We've come a long way from that perspective. We have like 2 ESL teams at World's Final this year, 2 ESL speakers, best speakers in the world in the last couple of years. So yeah, ESL teams are doing pretty well. Why do you think is that? And what were some challenges that maybe you experienced that other ESL speakers today maybe don't have to experience? Do you think anything has changed, or is it just a issue of we had to have some time to catch up with the meta and see what's up?
It's a good question, and I think this evolution is broader than just ESL speakers, uh, like the difference between ESL and EPL speakers becoming smaller to the level where it's practically non-existent nowadays. So, if you don't mind, Nikki, can we take a trip down memory lane? All right.
Go ahead.
So let's look at British parliamentary as a format. It is a fundamentally Anglo-Saxon type of activity. The name itself says it. Now look at Worlds. Worlds has been in existence since the late 70s. I think it was 79, but someone can Google this. Now, when it was initially created, it was dominated by like what you expect fancy Oxbridge, Eton style guys and Ivy League. And I'm using the term guys on purpose. It was even more male dominated than it is now or it was 10 years ago. Like the original statute of Worlds had explicitly written in that any changes to the statute need to be approved by the legacy countries, which were the United States, the member states of the UK, Australia, New Zealand. I'm not entirely sure if apartheid South Africa was also there, but that would serve to even validate the point further. And then, like in 2000, they changed it. You still have this legacy thing of status A countries, which need a qualified majority if you want to change anything in the world's constitution. If anyone ever asks why is that the case, it's a legacy of the previous constitution, which just said these names are above everyone else. So it was like culturally, it's been dominated by these types of folks. Like, look at how long the Cambridge or the Oxford Union have been in existence. While in different ESL countries, we do have a tradition of arguing more in some than in others, which also to some extent might explain why some countries have historically been good at debating more than others. It's not really been there. So what are things that start changing? I think a few things, like from a macro, let me talk about the macro level first, the broader global societal shifts, and then I am going to talk about debating itself. On a macro level, first is the internet. I mean, I know this makes me sound like a really old person, but let me give a bit of context. I'm sure there's people watching this. I'm sure you are doing this actively who would prep in part by like watching videos, debating workshops. I guess at this point, you're probably not doing it. You're giving those workshops. I'm sure there's many people who are accessing these resources. Correct me if I'm wrong, Nikki, but right now, if you wanted to do something like that, if let's say you're a second year speaker who's good, wants to go to their first major international, whatever that is, the problem isn't finding the resources. The problem is figuring out which ones are good. Which speech should I watch? Which workshop should I watch? Now, let me contrast that with when I started doing this sort of prep, which was roughly 10, 11 years ago. There were very few resources online. If you try to find videos of recorded debates prior to 2012, 13, you might get a World's Out round. You'll get some famous ones like the Horrors of War. But beyond that, it actually gets very, very sparse very quickly. And all of a sudden, you're looking at a video of the 1995 World's Finals where the style of speaking is like pure style and it's completely irrelevant for what you're trying to improve. And then Alfred Tuna Snyder, God bless his soul, had a very good channel, which like looks like 90s style internet, but had some good resources where you could collect some videos and watch those. So as time moved on, I would say especially 2014 onwards, there was a lot more streaming of rounds and recording of rounds, which allowed you to access the speaking styles of others. And I think a big shout out here goes to Radio MOF or MOF from North Macedonia, who were doing a lot of this stuff in Central Europe, which helped level the playing field, if you will. I think the second aspect was just the proliferation of low cost flights. In particular, this applies for the United States, for Europe, as well as for Southeast Asia. To some extent, India. The issue with India is it gets somewhat insular compared to these other regions, as well as lower purchasing power, which enabled people to go to more competitions than they have gone to before. And I mean, the results of this are very intuitive. If you look at Worlds or Euros tabs from 10, 15 years ago and compare the number of teams with the number of teams you had, all right, let's talk prior to 2020 because COVID distorted everything. But I think COVID is also an important factor. I'll get to that. It clearly shows this. And yes, I think the third one is the one I just mentioned. Like, obviously, COVID, for all the problems and suffering it has caused, did manage to initially stop debating. We can argue whether that was good or not. But beyond that, has made debating even more accessible to many people who were able to do many more competitions. And I think in particular, people from what is often referred to as the global south, most of sub-Saharan Africa, the Caribbean, chunks of India, who weren't able to access these competitions before. So I would say this is on the macro factors that helped facilitate this shift. I think when it comes to debating itself, I mean, the first one was inevitably there were going to be a couple of good ESL speakers that show up, and that would help with breaking a sort of glass ceiling or norm that like ESL speakers can't do good speeches. I think more broadly, in general, a long-term trend in debating, I would say for the last 20 years, from what I've been able to observe personally, as well as from my own speeches, is de-emphasizing style and emphasizing analytical rigor. Whether there's too much of that today or not, I don't really have a strong opinion on that. But I think it's definitely true you have moved more towards analytical rigor as time progressed. Why is that important? Because analytical rigor, even if your English is not perfect, is something that is comparably easier to build than is style when you're speaking in an accent and you can't use the exact same word, the exact right word at the exact right point in time. I think that helped ESL speakers a lot. So yeah, there you go. 5 reasons, Nikki.
As always, with the structural reasons. I think you said it well. You summed it up well. But I have to ask. Obviously, these are things that happened for a better of for the lack of a better word, naturally. I think a lot of these processes didn't come from people. Do you think, in terms of the glass ceiling that was removed, do you think this was a big part of the process, or something that just more or less was bound to happen? What I'm trying to get at is, do you think it's more about just the natural progression of things, or more about we as a community have, I don't know, removed certain stigma, or maybe have even made sure that by having ESL categories and all of these things, it actually helped? Or was it more of good debaters come from wherever?
I think having ESL helped massively, and that's one of the things. Like, there's also separate, like we were talking globally, there's also a separate history of Euros I haven't even touched upon. I think one of the things that helped was, I think from the very get-go, or from 2001, Euros had an ESL category. I think that helps. That sort of recognition for ESL speakers certainly contributed. Now, in terms of whether the shift was going to happen, I would say it was inevitable to happen at one point in time. I think more broadly, like as anyone who has argued those like affirmative action motions know, there is this argument on role models, and role models don't only work for like inspiring other speakers. Uh, they also work for showing the majority groups that the minorities. I guess in this case that's not entirely applicable, because very quickly like ESL speakers became the majority. But in general, like showing EPL speakers historically that yes, these folks can very much compete, because I think a lot of the EPL bias, as it was called, was not coming from like inherent malign intent or racism. It was just coming from a pure expectation that a certain person will just not be able to do anything in a given round other than get a fourth. And that led to people, for instance, not listening to extensions very carefully. It led to issues like saying, "Oh yeah, but they outframed you," whereas they just repackaged what you said. I know this term became also a buzzword a couple of years after me, like EPL extension. Uh, so I think as that was getting shown, it became easier. I think the other part, which people often disregard when they talked about this whole ESL bias category, what is my own experience there as well? I feel the issue with the so-called glass ceiling wasn't in discrimination, as I pointed out, but the separate part of that was judges. So I feel like in my time, you were most likely to experience ESL bias with mediocre judges, especially mediocre EPL judges. Once you hit top judges, these are people who can follow the flow of argument by and large and will listen to you carefully. And I think if I reflect on my experience, if I was speaking in front of people who were considered very good speakers in their time, I never had an issue along the lines of, I think they discounted my arguments because of ESL bias. There were a couple of bad calls, of course, but never those. However, there were issues when you hit your like mid-tier Iona judges. And these I struggle with the most. And the reason for that is they are shit debaters, and they would get allocated lower level EPL rooms, which tended to contain mid-level or higher level ESL teams based on how point distribution would work. And it was very hard to get out of those rooms. And because these people were idiots who were not able to weigh arguments correctly, they ended up just giving the call of least resistance. I think that's what caused the glass ceiling. So fundamentally, what you needed to break it was, yes, a couple of good teams who would be able to go beyond the middle rooms. Once you make it into the higher end of like, or your like top rooms or your lower top rooms, it was fair game in my experience by and large. And once you stay there long enough, people start to figure out who you are, and then all of a sudden, oh, there's this ESL team, um, and things slowly start shifting. Like, I mean, to share a personal anecdote, like when we were when we were at our prime, which was Euros 2014 and Worlds in 2015. Now, in 2014 in Euros, we won ESL, but for me, like the thing that's possibly even more important was we were constantly in the top room for 2/3. Like we were in the top room for the first 6 rounds. I mean, rounds 3 to 6. You didn't have an actual top room in rounds 1 and 2, of course. And we missed the open break on Speaks. And in terms of like overall Speaks, we were, I think, the third or fourth team on tab. That to me was arguably a more impressive achievement. And there you were like, oh yeah, there's this like ESL team in the top room that keeps beating people, and they keep beating them with arguments, and people start talking about this, and then like because it doesn't happen commonly, these like shitty judges who end up in the middle rooms hear about this. So like, all right, maybe we should listen to this ESL team, and then these things slowly start snowballing, and then you end up going to the next big competition, which was Worlds, and that makes things easier because people have heard about you as this pretty good ESL team that has a very old school Cambridge style of speaking, which we built on purpose at that point. And then, yeah, maybe ESL teams are good. And then a couple of other ones show up, and that starts snowballing into this. So, what was necessary? A couple of outliers. I am fortunate and privileged enough that I was part of those outliers. And I'm very happy that in the end, like, no one really cares if an ESL team does good or bad. They just care whether teams are doing good or bad. I am under the impression that it doesn't really matter that much to people anymore, which is just a good thing.
Yeah, I think I share the same experience, even when we were kind of starting out with the internationals more competitively. So for us, that was like end of 2019, 2020, where we really decided we're gonna try this out. Experience was you go to a random competition, especially online. Sometimes you can't get over the hump because you get a few questionable calls at the beginning. Then you get to a bubble room. In the bubble room, something happens, and because that bubble room on average had not so experienced judge than what you would have at a major competition. So with us, we ended up like our first proper competition was Oxford. We break open at Oxford. Then we have like, I don't know, around 15 competitions where we don't break open at all, which is like smaller tournaments. Then we go to Euros, we break open in ESL. So it's kind of like, you know, part of it is figuring out why you can't get over the hump, and then you get better judging at a major tournament, and things kind of work out for themselves. So from that perspective, I agree. It was never really a problem for me when you get to a good room to kind of, I don't know, be appreciated or break any glass ceilings. It's more of in the beginning of that journey, which in its own way, I think it makes ESL teams, you know, kind of harder. How do you say? Hard times create strong men.
Yes.
So
I think the fundamental problem, if I can just build on this, and I don't have a solution for it. I've discussed it with people, and there are big cons to each of these. The fundamental problem is how judging allocations are done. So I don't know, like, were you ever on the A team of a major international?
to be soon next Worlds.
All right, nice. So yeah, maybe you can help to remedy this. But typically, what I understand is you will just allocate. I mean, you'll do your pre-allocations before the draw is done, but your pre-allocations are based on the overall numbering of rooms. So you will, for many people, as a first priority, you'll try to ensure that the first 10 to 15 rooms have solid judges in them, and then you will cover everything else. Reason for this being is because of the logistical hassle of such a large competition, it is difficult to also bear in mind where the ESL teams are, especially as there is so many of them. Now, as you go into day three, particularly rounds 8 and 9, this becomes slightly better because you will see in this room, even though like the three EPL teams are dead, these fourth folks could still make ESL. But still, even there, in terms of prioritization, this room will be significantly lower than the room which could break into EPL. And that has been the fundamental problem in creating this sort of environment where you get mediocre judges who just would go for the path of least resistance. Now, the bonus there is like, I'm not entirely sure, like, just giving the win to a team that's EPL is the path of least resistance anymore, but it most certainly was at the time.
Yeah, I think it's not a problem that you can ever fix. It's a logistical issue. You have a lot of people. I think what has become better is the overall pool of judges that you have. So I think right now the average judge at a debate tournament, at least BP debate tournament, because World School sucks, but the average judge at a BP tournament, especially at a major one, I think is significantly better than the average judge that you had in 2014, 2015, maybe even 2016. So that kind of helps out with allocations a lot. You have different things to consider. It's also like, how do you judge judges? What types of criteria do you have? I don't know how it was done before. Now I think it's fairly holistic. It's always going to be subjective, but there are ways to do it better, like using algorithms and things such as that. It's not perfect science, but it's a science. Science is better than feelings in that regard. So I think it has become for the better. We'll see at next Worlds. We'll try to do it the best way possible. With that being said, what do you think are the best moments that you personally had as like competitor / person in your competitive journey? I mean, obviously winning the tournament might be your highlight, but I figure out sometimes the highlights are never these particular moments, but rather certain points of the journey. So what would you say were your highlights from your perspective?
It's a good question. So there's a couple of them. These, like, I mean, I can obviously talk about like the point when you win Euros and like you're holding a trophy, sure. But I think there's more interesting ones. I mean, these make you appreciate some of the broader aspects of the activity. So I would say there are three I want to highlight. First one being like first time when I go into an EPL room and I realize I've been taken seriously. So to give a bit of context, 2014, we just came out of the ESL finals in Chennai, but we were a bit of an outlier there because the other three teams were much older and established speakers. We clearly lost the final, so that's beyond the question. So there was this tingling feeling. All right, this might have been a fluke, right? Who are these folks? Some two kids from Belgrade with much more established teams, and they just go out in the finals. Now, after that, we do a couple of competitions, like regional, like Budapest, and there's some like, all right, you we won the finals, but it was still like a predominantly ESL competition. So you really haven't entirely proven that you have a claim to be anything more than like a good ESL speaker. And then there was like this random tournament in Serbia in Aranđelovac. Now, despite it being an entirely random regional tournament, uh, through a weird set of circumstances, they get Harish Natarajan, so who just CA'd Worlds, to come over and CA it. A couple of really good judges, and they do a small competition. It's like 24 teams. But one of the teams they got was like probably the top team at Cambridge at that point, who randomly decided to come to this competition in Serbia, and they are in Aranđelovac. And I mean, obviously, yeah, they ended up on +5 out of 5. They won the semis. They won the finals. But the thing I appreciated was like we were at 2 instances close to shaving off a point from them. I still think it is the call that was made in those 2 rounds was correct, but it was close. And the team was Ashish Kumar and Jawei Lee. So now we're going into Paris, which is a more important prep tournament and has teams who have high ambitions at Euros. And we play it fair and square, and we make it into the top room. Now that top room has Ashish and MDG in it. It has Harish speaking with Alon Wandam, and it has another team I forgot by now, but also a team that broke at Euros. And all of a sudden, like it's not like there's this feeling like we don't belong here, and teams are taking you seriously. Like they spend 4 or 5 minutes to respond to you, and they still lose. So we still win the round, and that was the point when I realized, all right, I mean, if you do a good enough job, if you know the motion well enough, and you're well prepped, and you think strategically in your speech, there is no reason you can't beat them. Especially as like I think now like one other aspect I would want to add in like this evolution in debating, Nikki, is now you have all sorts of schools who do well in debating. Universities which you might not consider the best in the world are still having debating achievements. Back then, it was a lot more correlated with the actual or perceived, let's leave that discussion for another day, quality of the university. So you would get your Oxbridges dominating your Euros. I think at one point it was like 3 Oxfords in a row. Ivies would be doing very, very well at Worlds, and no other schools would be. And you had a couple of top-notch Australian schools there as well. In Australia, it gets a bit more controversial what are top schools, so I won't name them. Um, so there was also not just this perception of like a bias against you because your English is not as good, but also like I come from the University of Belgrade at that point in time, which isn't a top-notch school by any means of measurement. And also like mentally, like thinking like, oh, these folks come from some of the best educational institutions in the world, and I can still beat them at this particular activity was also another mental barrier you need to go through. I mean, also to some extent, this was apparently an objective problem. That's also like I think why at one point the decision was made at Worlds that it's just like your last names rather than school names, which by the way I do disagree with. But who asked for my opinion? So this was the first moment. Second moment was aforementioned Euros in 2014, not the finals again. It was round 3. We were so like you proved that at Paris that you can occasionally win in a room where like with other teams, right? But all right, now Paris is still like a random competition. Now you're at the major international, and we managed to win the first 2 rounds. And in round 3, we're in the room with the 2 favorites of the competition, and then one team that was not particularly good. So I'm like, okay, we'll be lucky if we take a third. And then the motion was not the best motion ever set, but fortunately we were on the side that benefited from that. So you know as well, right? Opening up on a stupid motion, it's not that difficult to do well. And I still remember it was Oxford A, and like the first speaker speaking, and like midway through, and I think it's even barely audible on the recording, all this in Serbian. I turned towards Helena. I'm like, am I missing something, or is what he's saying complete shit? And then we just proceed to destroy them. And that was the point where people started talking, oh, there's this really good ESL team. What I talked about before, right? When we think about breaking biases, there's this really good ESL team that ended the day on +3. And then on day 2, they proceeded to take another 2 seconds, one of which was unfair, before being complete shit in round 6. But that's another story. So to me, that was like the second and more important validation. And the third one was probably Malaysia World quarters, which is my favorite speech which I ever gave. I'm so sorry that it's not recorded. But it was emotion on regretting the decline of secular pan-Arab nationalism. And it is such an enjoyable moment because in terms of what I was doing as a speaker and what was, I would say, my competitive advantage, I just knew lots of stuff. I know lots of data and I'm good at memorizing it. I was not always great at expressing it. So this motion, I knew shitloads about. And then we have the most hysterical prep ever, where my partner Helena, she's like, all right, but you're telling me a fact. You're not telling me what this means for the argument. And then we had this back and forth where I'm yelling at her. And I'm like, no, you don't understand because you're stupid. But she is making me do the right thing, which is operationalizing facts I know into a compelling argument. And to be honest, false modesty aside, the way we crushed Monash, who was the reigning world champion, at that point was borderline humiliating. I was visually pointing out where Chad is on the map of Africa to them. So it was quite humiliating. And it was such an enjoyable speech for me to give. And despite the stress of everything, it was so rewarding to walk out of that round. I'm like, yeah, if I don't make it into a world semi now, I am never going to be good enough to make it. Because I can't do better than this. Also, one of the team that went through with us were Boseo and Fanele Mashwama, who became, I think, more famous amongst more recent debaters for speeches, which I consider nowhere close to their best speeches and are more rhetorics than actual debating. But they are proper debate speeches they also had. It's just that unfortunately many of these are not recorded. But even Fanele told us, I think we're second, but you guys kicked our ass, so you're going through. So that's the third moment. I think what unites all three of these is for me these were points of validation that you can do more than you thought you could, and that things which you thought were insurmountable when you started, with a sufficient degree of coaching, effort, and persistence, are possible. If you go back to what I said at the beginning, right? When I started speaking, Oxbridge institutions to us were an ideal. They were an ideal of how good it is possible for someone to get. It's just that someone is never going to be yourself or another ESL speaker because they are simply too good. And we even had some unrealistic conceptions about them. Your top Cambridge speaker, like Harish, he knows what he's going to talk about at 5:30 in a speech. And then you speak with him once and you realize, no, man, he can fuck up time management so badly.
There's so many things to unpack from what you said. But I have an interesting question. And I have a few follow-up questions to what you outlined now. But do you think part of your motivation, even subconsciously, or what helped you kind of break the glass ceiling or whatever, let's use leftist terminology, was it part of it because you're Serbian? And let me explain that. I think from the Bulgarian perspective, on a cultural level, there is always some complex towards the West, right? You're from. Maybe this is not true for Serbia. That's why I'm asking it like this.
Go for it. I want to hear.
But there's always this complex of the Westerners. They have better backgrounds, they come from the better country, etc., etc. So on a national level, even without your peers, debaters, intellectuals, or whatever, there is this general feeling when you grow up in Eastern Europe or some country like that, which is kind of like you always look up to these particular institutions and to the West in general. And in some people, that this also creates a feeling of a little bit of resentment, a little bit of like, oh, because I grew up in this culture, and I want to show it to the Oxfords, I want to show it to the Harvards, I want to show it to the Westerners that I can beat them at their own game, even if I'm not a representative of these large institutions who are perceived to hold uh, most of the intellectual capital of the world, if that makes sense.
Yes, I can definitely relate to that. So I would say initially that wasn't necessarily my motivation. I would say, I mean, yeah, initially I was driven locally. After that, it was just like, all right, let me try to win the ESL. I think I can do it. This was my thinking from 2013 onwards. But yes, once you smell a bit of blood, I mean, part of it is just like pure competitiveness. Part of that, does this exist there? I will not deny that it does to an extent. Yes, you have much higher resources. Yes, you have the Oxford and Cambridge Union paying for your travel, partly from obnoxious reg fees, for which I get to sleep on a floor of Ashisha's dorm room, which, by the way, was a very enjoyable experience, but I still slept on the floor. Yes, there is a bit of that. I think it is a part of culture in our part of the world. I think I mean if I really want to go into cultural anthropology, I think that sort of stubbornness is also to some extent why Serbians are good at sports. Like why we have the top NBA player at the moment and possibly the best tennis player of all time. Yes, that sort of persistence. Like, yeah, you have better resources than me, but if I try twice as hard, I can beat you at your own game. And I think when it comes to this, like it also drove how I thought about debating. So, man, I would over prep content. Like 2014, ISIS was a big thing. Everyone, like, you had a very good chance of emotion about ISIS, no matter where you went to. People were reading The Economist, and like if they were really into it, they would maybe read like that long report, which is in the middle of The Economist. I was reading military blogs, understanding the formations of the Kurdish Peshmerga, because my logic was I cannot speak English better than they do. I cannot do it stylistically better than they do. I am not as educated, and I don't come from as good a school as they do. But man, I am going to know far more than they do. And then, sure, beat me when we talk about Peshmerga battalions and sniper tactics.
So this is a great flow to the other question that I had related to your what you were talking about. So you mentioned competitive advantage. So is content your biggest competitive advantage as compared to other speaker? And the question in general is what makes Siri uniquely a very good debater as opposed to other debaters? What did you do better than the others?
So I think in my time, what we did on purpose was at that point you had a pretty distinct ESL style, and this varied country to country, but it was very different what you were getting from EPL speakers. My understanding at one point in time was even though I have an accent and I don't speak English as fast as someone else does, I control a good vocabulary, which allows me to be pretty precise with the words I use in a debating speech. So this means, in other words, even though like I will not say as many words as you can, I can put out as much content as you can using a smaller or fewer number of words. So I realized that I am able to do that more than most ESL speakers. I'm able to, I have a relatively wide vocabulary, and I realize I can use that to my advantage. So the second thing I realized is I don't need case files because I can memorize things pretty well. The third thing I had, which fewer other people's, like fewer ESL speakers at that time had, was a very good partner who was very, very, very good at English and very fast at speaking in a very soft accent. So it was easy to comprehend, even like when she was speaking super fast. And then finally, she was also able to cover areas I am not good in, which is any motion that includes the word narrative or expectation in it, or anything fluffy that's not tangible, which I have struggled with historically as a speaker, and I've always counted on my partners to write my speeches in those motions. Or like any of those annoying hypothetical pill, or like you're creating a new society on a planet that's inhabitable. Like, what the hell is that, folks? Let's debate actual things. So I think what helped me was I was aware of those competitive advantages, and I just utilized them. The last thing is rebuttal. Like, I think here as debating became more focused on an analytical rigor, it suited me because I was able to identify logical leaps in people's cases not relatively easily. That's too generous, but perhaps more easily than some others. And then I was able to weaponize that, and I was at the right place in the right time where that became more where analysis was becoming more and more important than style. Now this did lead to cases where I would do sometimes like 5 or 6 minutes of rebuttal, and then like judges sometimes took this against me, but that helped. That helped me a lot. And I think the result of all of this was we were just able to drop a lot of content. So I know people talk about EPL extensions. They very frequently, particularly if we were top half, teams behind us would not have a lot to say. And I think if I think about, I don't know, my influence on people after me or whatever, that might be a bit too much, right? Because there's many factors influencing people. I think a lot more ESL people realize you can also matter them. And different teams were doing this to different extents, but I think that's like one of the things I was able to take big advantage of and help me. And I wouldn't say necessarily grow as a speaker, but it certainly helped to grow my accomplishments.
Well, dude, let's not be humble, okay? I don't know a good ESL speaker that hasn't watched you and Helena speak and molded parts of their style to you. That's one thing to say. Second thing to say, yes, I think a lot of the successful ESL teams right now, me and Rumen included, have very similar strategies that you have kind of chosen to do. This is kind of connected to when we were talking about matter dumping. Obviously, it can be done in different ways. So one is you're very good at English, you say a lot of things. The other is you say a lot of things, but you actually prove them. Those are two possible strategies that people are employing right now.
They're also doing a lot more framing, and weighing, which is the Tel Aviv influence,
Yeah,
which I wasn't doing as much of as I should have. I did start doing it towards the end of my debating, but I was nowhere close to good at it as Tel Aviv was, which made for an interesting conflict of styles when we would run into each other.
Yeah, that's a absolutely interesting observation. I do think that TSL teams right now are kind of a combination for the Israel style, and let's call it, I don't know, Belgrade Serbian style or whatever.
Belgrade style is just 2010, 2011, 2012 Cambridge style. It's heavily influenced by it. Like if you watch Karish and Jack Watson, like Belgrade Euros, I think if someone who really watches debating speeches compares that to the style Helena and I have, there are many similarities, and that's on purpose. Like these were our main influences. Shengwu to some extent before, but he had a slightly different style. But in terms of just loads of content, that's like pure Jack Watson and Harish.
I have interesting question. Euros 2014. If I have my data correct, you were Belgrade B.
Yes.
Why?
I see you've been feeded the right questions, Nikki. So recall the point I made before about having issues with the way in which Serbian debating was adjudicated and weighted. This is I wouldn't say it's the culmination, but to some extent it is like it's the final point of it, after which it could not be recognized anymore that we are not the top Serbian team. Like a Euros title when no one else has won one in the past is difficult to disprove. So context-wise, very briefly, like it was 9 rounds, BP power pairing. There were very obviously the two best Serbian teams at that point in time were Georgi Jovicevic and Marija Simic, and Helena and myself. I mean, look, this is not to show any disrespect, but they were nowhere close, in my opinion, to being as good as we were at that point. Particularly not Maria. However, the judges who are part of the same generation of debaters as they are thought otherwise. And I mean, over the course of 9 rounds, this would mean that, I mean, let me perhaps share a blatant example of what I mean by this. So we speak in the finals versus, going back to Arangelo, that's this example I had of when we were close to beating Jiawei and Ashish. I mean, saying you were close to beating someone doesn't make it an achievement. But like when you had no history of even being close to an EPL team, it means a lot to you that you get close to beating them even in 1 or 2 rounds. So in the finals, they were using a couple of buzzwords. I don't know. I think it was the word lionize or something. So you go into a round versus Georgia and Maria, where like they use the term lionize 3 or 4 times, the same way people were saying pernicious 7, 8 years ago, and now they're using terms like delta. It's just like buzzwords, like, oh, if I use the words a good debater speaks, I will become a good debater. And incorrectly in that round, Georgia and Maria win. Now, funnily, they used the term lionize a couple of times, and they heard it when they were watching Ashish and Jiawei speak in Arangelovac. They were hearing them speak because they were in the audience watching the finals. Across them in the finals was our team, not theirs. Theirs was in the audience. I think that speaks to like who was where at that point in time. So yeah, it was a result of a series of, I wouldn't say like criminal, but definitely incorrect calls, which led to them ending up with more points than we did. I think, like, to quote a chess player, during Zagreb Euros, the debating spoke for itself.
Well, you did think of the word criminal. You could have skipped it, but you used it. So let's keep it maybe for the thumbnail. Was there trash talking?
There was not direct trash talking, but there was. Sorry, between the two. All right, between the teams that were competing, like for top spots. I mean, like in Serbia historically, these were characters which didn't really like make big headlines in international debating. So I imagine very few people have heard of them. But yeah, I mean, it's fair to say I did not get along the best with Maria. I also didn't get along the best with Victor Perla, who were I think, very solid ESL speakers. Victor was almost the CA of Euros as well. Maria has a couple of ESL breaks to her in her day. I had no grudge against Georgia at any point in time. So there was no trash talking. It was very clear when we spoke against each other in those different rounds that people didn't really like each other, and there would be minimal to no interaction. I would say mostly no interaction outside of the rounds. And I mean, also within my big group, which is like the cohort I started with when it came to Serbian debating, I made my displeasure with their speaking style and judging style and philosophy of debating very, very publicly known. So I don't think this was a big secret. I think, like, if obviously, I mean, 9 years later or 8 years later, I really hold no grudges or bad blood against anyone for like something we did back in the day. We were both younger, and it was an important thing in our lives. Ultimately, it's a activity where people talk for 7 minutes. But I think more broadly, one thing I still stand behind is they had a fundamentally wrong philosophy of debating. And it isn't just my results which prove that it was wrong. Also, I had the benefit of being a small to moderate influence on people who came after me, people like Miloš Maganovic, people like Janko Djordjevic, uh, to a lesser extent maybe on the Croatians, but I would say this is significantly lower. I think their results versus the results that these folks before me made do indicate that perhaps I was not entirely wrong in terms of how I approached this. Now, in hindsight, perhaps I should have been more polite in my disagreements and more constructive. But, like, being 21, you can afford yourself to be a bit of a dick to people.
It makes for more interesting time for sure. One more story my little birdies told me to ask you about. I believe this was during Malaysia Worlds, and Helena bit her tongue.
Yeah.
Can you tell us more about that?
Sure. So going back to that quarterfinals I mentioned, like the one about secular pan-Arab nationalism. So we're on closing up, and Helena was always doing whips. I was always doing member speeches. The member speech was, in my opinion, at that point in time, definitely good enough to take us. So for context, I forgot who opening up were. I think they were Auckland. Could be some other team. Opening up were Harvard A, Bo and Fanele, and closing up was Monash A. So my thinking after top half is, all right, OG beats OO. CG has an extension, which I think is bad. I respond to it. Like my geography lesson. There are, however, some good responses in the Gov Whip to my speech. So my thinking is, all right, we beat OO. We are probably winning, but I can justify a call in which we are third if we don't respond to closing Gov's responses to our case. We don't need to further emphasize the responses to their case because their case is out. So Helena goes out. Like, I mean, in terms of content, for reference, like Helena and mine was an equal partnership, but there were parts which she knew better, parts which I knew better. I think when it came to tangible stuff, in particular international relations, which this motion is very much about, that was definitely my strong point. It wasn't necessarily her strong point. So even though like the prep was constructive on both sides, in terms of content, which you need to respond, that was largely with me. So she goes out to give her speech. And towards the 1 minute mark, you hear like a click. And all right, maybe it's whatever, some tick. Now, as her speech is going on, I see her mouth getting more and more red. And I'm like, fuck, is she gonna collapse? At one point, like, blood starts dripping down her lip. What happened, of course, is, yeah, she bit her tongue and she started bleeding. And I'm looking at her like super dead serious. Like, I mean, I made jokes about this, which was like, that I thought like, all right, finish the speech, then you can collapse and go to the hospital. But in reality, of course, I was caring that she's okay. Like, I hope it's nothing serious. But yes, in the back of my mind, I was also worried about the debating speech, but not in the order in which I pointed it out. That one just made for a good story. And yeah, like she's getting more and more bloody. But the thing is, like, I am looking at her in a very, very serious and concerned way. Now, apparently, she is not feeling the pain at that point in time, whether it's due to adrenaline or something else. So she is getting concerned by me getting concerned. And at one point, like when the judge claps for like 6 minutes, I guess she starts feeling the blood dripping down her lower lip and cheek, and she like wipes it off, and she sees it's a handful of blood. She's shocked for 2 seconds. Judges are shocked because everyone's aware what's happening. And she just proceeds to finish the speech. She was like, fine. And then she runs over to me. She's like, did I fuck up? Did I fuck up? I'm like, no, man, but you're bleeding. You had a good speech, but you're bleeding. Like, I thought you were going to collapse. So that's the story.
Balkan women are something special for sure.
Yeah.
So another good story that I had to ask about, obviously I had to ask about it. Scottish Euros versus Riga.
I see you were well fed. I think I also know who your source is. Scottish Euros versus Riga. Right. All right. Let me. I guess here I should probably share a bit of context. So this was the bid for Euros in 2018. The reason, like your casual listener does not remember a Scottish Euros nor a Riga Euros, is the reason none of these two happened. I'll get to that in a minute. This bid was going on during 2016 Euros. So this is my second Euros which I won. It was with MDG. So it was clear like you were speaking with a strong brand name. So there was an expectation you would do well, but it's also added the need to prep, but also a bit of pressure, right? So there's a couple of stories here. One, people often forget. There was a third bid there, which was Hull Euros, which actually was a pretty good bid. Its only problem was that it's in Hull. Like Hull tried to bid 3 times. All 3 times they had solid bids. It's just that like they couldn't get away from the fundamental problems of who the hell wants to go to Hull, and they haven't been able to solve for that. So there's this bid, and like they announced properly 6 months before Euros, right? And then around the same time, Edinburgh and Riga announced. Around the same time was in April, so there's another 4 months. Now we had this fundamental issue in Riga that there was a lack of good female speakers in Europe whom you could legitimately put on a bid, and they had a strong CV. I mean, if you look at Olivia's CV, there is no major. I think there was only one break in going out in the first out round of a major international there. The only good speaker with a track record behind him was Monica Foreman. Monica Foreman was already on the Hull bid, unfortunately. So I had one choice, like only one. I mean, this may sound harsh, but my philosophy also has been, while obviously a bid should have both a male and a female member, my philosophy in debating then was, and it's my philosophy today as well, that we shouldn't have a woman there just for the sake of having a woman. I know this may be controversial, particularly considering debating's constant shift towards the left, but that is my belief and has remained my belief. So I asked the only one person who was still to some extent active and had an interest. That was Tasha Rahman, who was in the Malaysia World Finals, previously of Oxford. Very good judge, very intelligent. Would have loved to have her on the team. At that point, she was going into Bridgewater Associates, so it wasn't really her thing. So at this point, I'm like, all right, which other female candidate can I get? And there were not that many options which had like at least, I mean, essentially I couldn't find a female that had 2 international breaks and like won anything of note at that point in time. So yeah, I'm struggling a bit. So I asked MDG to do it. He doesn't want to. Essentially, like he wants to focus on Euros, and he's already at that point CAing Worlds and DCAing Worlds. So my next choice is Lahav. Lahav, being the loyal Israeli he is, doesn't want to go up against a fellow Israeli. So now I'm at choice 4. Choice 4 is Thomas Simpson. So Tom is one of these guys people have forgotten. Absolutely sharp guy, very good debater, but fundamentally a stereotype of everything which NAMDA and non-Oxbridge England hates about Oxbridge debaters. Comes off as arrogant, pretty right-wing economically, voices his opinion in a very, very blunt fashion. I would say his appointment certainly didn't win me any votes, and it may have lost me some. So now we're there. Now, in terms of the infrastructure, we objectively have the better one. Like Riga at that point in time had this incredibly competent team of people from Stockholm School of Economics, Riga, who have been organizing at that point, the largest competition in Central Europe consistently for a couple of years in a row. You were talking 80 plus teams. People were hosted in a 4-star hotel consistently. There was like a drunk debate. They had hangover drinks. It was just it was not only exceptionally well organized, but it was in particular incredibly well organized for a competition of that size. Sure, like when it came to Central Europe, like the first Sofia Open, for example, Nikki, was immensely luxurious. But that competition had 20 teams, right? And it was heavily funded, I think, from the British Embassy through Miroslav Mavrov. But Riga was more or less self-standing, other than some things from the school. And like this was an Orcom I could put my hand in the fire for. So they got a 4-star hotel. I knew they could execute on anything needed. Every time previously I was seeing Riga, they would execute on things. Now Edinburgh. Let's go in Edinburgh. They get Duncan Crowe and Olivia Sundberg Diaz. Olivia had covered. I have nothing against her, but she does not have the accomplishments at that point in time, which I think are necessary in order to be a Euro CA. Duncan has a Worlds final in Chennai, and is rather than me voicing my opinion, let me describe how an unnamed Israeli describes Duncan's judging. He says, when you go into a debate, analysis is important. And all things being equal, unless if you're crazy, the team with the best analysis will win the round, assuming they're proving their side of the argument is more true, of course. With Duncan, analysis doesn't matter. It just matters that you say things. So like all these stereotypes you have about EPL extensions, they don't work with Duncan because you can just say things and Duncan will automatically credit them. I have this hypothesis that with him, like if it's this House would debate, one that involves a model, if you're able to model out things and just say lots of stuff in the PM speech, the debate can more or less end at that point in time because he will credit everything. So not the best judge. So you have someone with limited experience and someone who's a bad judge. Now, other things that happen. So this is where the story gets more interesting now that I provided a bit of context. They do heavy lobbying, and they start reaching out for like some of the non-standard countries, which you wouldn't expect to see at Euros. They also have the unique advantage of Duncan being secretary of Euros Council, so knowing all the people that were represented. For example, some random German goes on exchange to the University of St. Gallen in Switzerland. All of a sudden, Switzerland is a member of Euros Council. And yeah, these votes get pocketed because I'm not even aware of Switzerland's existence. Now, to be fair, there were faults on our side as well. I mean, other than the choice of CAs and co-CAs, we also did not do active lobbying with votes we considered safe. And some of these votes, which we considered safe, like the Austrian vote, ended up becoming abstentions. But the most interesting part is the final Euros Council. So prior to that in Malaysia, I was, I think, for all intents and purposes, sexually harassed by who was then Euros Council president. This involved her getting heavily pushy when I was very, very drunk after making the open break. I think if genders were reversed, this is a kind of thing which would not only get an individual cancelled, it would potentially open criminal proceedings. I mean, also my best friends Harish and Helena, for the sake of amusement, decided to leave me with this person. Now, I decided to not press against it. I thought it was my own fault I get drunk. 8 months later, uh, the vote is 16-16 in Euros Council. The casting vote is with the council president. Can you guess how the council president votes? Now, I think to prove their incompetence, of course, this Euros never happened because even though they had apparent commitments from the university told them, oh yeah, it's not going to happen. And then they decide to host Euros in Novi Sad, where to add a bit more insult to injury, their convener was someone who was also accused of the same thing as the Euros Council president. So, and it's especially funny at the point at which Tom and I are considered edgy, non-PC, that a Euros Council president who has sexually harassed your truly, and then another person who has done the same becomes the convener of Euros. I think it in many ways speaks to the hypocrisy you see in high-level debating.
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff there. So how do you feel after this happened? Do you say like fuck debating as a whole, or were you just like shit happens? What was your general reaction? Obviously, like now you have years behind it. It's different perspective. But back at that moment, how did you feel?
Look, at that moment, that is happening on the morning of the 24th of August. The Euros final is in the afternoon of the 24th of August. I was, of course, disappointed about it, but my priority, the more important thing for me was winning Euros in Open. Then, which at that point in time, it didn't technically make me the first ESL speaker to win Open because there's a team from Groningen in the Netherlands that won it in 2004. But there is, that was prior to Oxford and Cambridge starting to compete at Euros. And if you go back to what I said, they were the dominant institutions in debating, I would say, until 2016-17 when it came to Europe. So it was very important for me to try to bag that achievement. So yeah, it was a bit disappointing, but I didn't really focus on it. And then by the evening, I was just waiting for the announcements. But a couple of days after, of course, when I thought about it in hindsight, I didn't, like, for me, it wasn't the end of the world. Like, same as with any other failure in life. I pause and think, all right, sure, it might be a bit unfair, but what are the things you did wrong? And there were a couple of things we did wrong. I flagged some of these. And I did really feel sorry for the Riga folks because they put in a lot of effort into this, and I'm sure they would have hosted an amazing tournament. And Edinburgh obviously was not capable of hosting one because otherwise they would have. So that was like my biggest feeling of loss actually was not for me. It was for the absolutely amazing, the amazing Orcom I had. I had Ruta, I had Ernest, a couple of other people there as well. Yeva Skriver, they were absolutely top notch.
That's fair enough. Well, next year we'll have another Scottish Euros. Hopefully this time it's better.
And
If
hopefully
not,
it happens.
hopefully it does happen indeed. So this is the segue to our biggest segment on the show, which is obviously the greatest debaters of all time conversation. But I would like to start with the spicier part of this conversation, which is How do you feel, in your opinion? Obviously, you haven't been active for the last few years, but you've seen stuff, you heard stuff, you talked to some people. Uh, has debating gone in the right direction? Let's say comparing your era to nowadays, in your opinion.
Sure. So, broadly speaking, the answer is yes. I think it has become leveled. I think the playing field, while never entirely equal, is more equal than it ever was. I think that trend is generally good. I mean, it's demonstrated A by results, as you also pointed out, like the prospect of an ESL speaker breaking into open is not even a piece of news anymore. It's a large part of the break, and it's in no way surprising that an ESL team wins a major competition. I'm also very happy that I think the Zagreb team was the first one to do that. I think 2 years ago. So I'm very happy that last part of what you would call the glass ceiling has been broken. I think also like it's also become a lot more accessible from people from countries who usually would not be able to afford to travel, but can at least afford a solid, if not good, internet connection. So I think that's just objectively good. Now, in terms of style, look, I've stopped being actively involved in 2017, and my involvement has been very low since 2020 when the pandemic started. I just didn't enjoy doing things online. This being said, I never avoid an answer to a question. Debating has definitely become more analytical. There is more burden on teams to prove statements. Style has been de-emphasized. Whilst I mean, framing is obviously more important. I think that's probably the biggest contribution of the Tel Aviv A team from 5, 6 years ago to debating. Whilst I, in general, do think that is good, there is one thing I want to mention. Style, as it's defined, or at least was defined by the judging guides a couple of years ago, is ultimately important to the extent to which it helps make your arguments clear. What I take from this is that style is not insignificant. It just is only important insofar as it explains arguments. Now, if speakers today, from what I've seen, like I've judged worlds in 2021, the summer one, wherever that was. I think it was Seoul.
Where you made some bad calls, as I remember.
So yeah, so did others. But glad that you recovered. Um, I am under the impression that people speak faster than ever before. I presume judges have also adjusted to this and are largely able to keep their flows. Now, if you take this to its full extent, and I'm not making a slippery slope argument here, I'm just trying to explain the logic. If you take this to its full extent, you end up with those ridiculous American formats where people say 500 words a minute. I think the point I'm trying to make here isn't necessarily that debating is going there, but if your general trends continue, you need to figure out what is this point where you've reached the limitations of how much more you can sacrifice style. Because otherwise, it will just become a competition in fast speaking. In my era, like the way style worked and the way I used it was you would just vary the speed of your speech. You dump content as fast as possible and you're speaking relatively quickly. But then when you reach the really important bits of your analysis, you would stop and emphasize those. You would use stylistic framing to explain what these mean. And I don't mean like Bosel, who's much more style than analysis. I mean more along the lines of still weaponizing style to make the arguments more powerful. I've, at least in my limited experience in online judging, which is 2.5 competition, I'm under the impression that this is getting more and more lost. Not necessarily a problem as long as people can follow it, but there is a point in time when you should say, all right, we might be talking too fast.
Oh yeah, and I mean, look, I think there's some outliers for sure. I think it's an interesting conversation to have.
I think
I
like
am,
Matt Cato topped the tab, who speaks like 300 miles an hour. And then he like top, I think speaker tab or something at Worlds. So
yeah,
obviously you see the trend.
yeah, of course, he was the best speaker in the world that year. I think 6 months after that, he didn't do. I mean, he did comparatively better, but not in the speaker tab in terms of not being the best in the last year. But I think it's interesting because I don't know. Like I am a very for lack of a better word stylistic speaker, mostly because I can speak fast. Um, so kind of just do with what you can. I'm not sure like if you've seen my recent speeches, but it's more on the style.
Last
And
one I saw is when I kicked you out, regrettably. I mean,
yes,
there
yes,
stylistically you were fine.
yeah. I have fun with my speeches. Let's say it like that. I've always been proud of that particular fact. Anyway, yeah, I think you have a point, and I think it's gonna be interesting to see when do we actually reach that point, and if we reach that point. In terms of there are still a lot of different speakers with different styles that come into debating, so only time will show whether like speakers like Matt Kate or Naomi are an outlier or more of the general rule. It's I think there are different role models for different things. If you can take away the best points of those, you'll find yourself somewhere in that particular middle that you say, which is some parts of your speech you do fast, others not so fast, and you kind of prioritize the correct content as opposed to just using your speech as a. I think I compared it like a shotgun, which splashes damage. So you put a bunch of arguments in your shotgun and you splash damage versus a good sniper rifle where you pick the correct point and you headshot in that particular direction. I think that's how I would propose it. So
Yeah.
speaking of these different styles, who do you think is or are some of the most overrated debaters throughout history?
Overrated. That's a good one. So let me go through like first in the era before mine. A lot of people speak very highly of Sally Rooney, whom I guess like your casual viewers now will might not even know she's a debater or a former debater. Will know her for her novels. I think in terms of style, it was extremely good. I actually don't think there was that much on content there. I think even more perniciously, this trend of crazy left wing arguments in debating was started by her, which I am deeply annoyed by. It started in my era, from what I understand. It has not stopped in my era, but has gone more left. So that's one person that definitely comes to mind, and was held in very high esteem during her prime. She also stopped debating relatively early. She wasn't in the activity too long. I think secondly, while I still think he is a good speaker, I think during my time people tended to have a far too generous view of Vinu Goswami, who was in the Thessaloniki World Finals. Reason for this being, while Vinu and Joe, I mean, all right, when it comes to Vinu and Joe, like Joe was actually not that bad, but he was never held in high esteem. He was always considered as being pulled by his partner. So you can't say he's overrated because he was not too highly rated to begin with. I think in terms of the stuff he did, he was analytically very good in like just assessing arguments, like the kinds of things which Lahav would do better a couple of years later. He was doing that as well. there was a lack of common sense in many of these cases, and they did a lot of crazy stuff, which made no sense. I think similar to this, Boseo, even though stylistically possibly the best speaker I ever saw, also one that kicked me out of my world semi, but that's not really the crucial reason I'm pointing it out here. I think actually on that team, I considered Fanele the much better speaker of the two. And in rounds where I've seen them, which were perhaps not recorded, Fanele was doing a lot of the analytical work. Bo was stylistically very good, but there's also points like in Malaysia Worlds, and I don't know whether the finals of Malaysia is recorded or not, but these guys were out of the debate. Like they were on CO, they ran a case that made no sense. CG refuted them in 20 seconds and then just proceeded to weigh their case versus top half and ultimately unfairly lose in a 5-4 split decision. So these are like, yeah, these folks are definitely there. Is there anyone I'm missing? Let me see towards the years after. So around my time, I think around my time, people were, I think, fairly assessed in terms of how good or bad they are. Let me think about ESL. I mean, there were some people back in the day who were considered very good in ESL standards back when ESL and EPL. Oh, yeah. Actually, I do have a more recent example. I mean, look, I like the guy. I spoke with him, but I don't think Tin is as good as people think that he is. I think frequently he would run fringe cases, which, well explained, again, don't make a lot of sense and can't be relatively easily refuted by just looking at the fundamental premise. I think the best example of this is if you look at instances where he didn't speak with Lovro Sprem. Lovro, like, while expressively not the best debater ever, just has a very strong intuition and understanding of what is important. I think that's part of the reason why they operated very well as a team. I think, like, if you look at the percentage of cases that were completely crazy, I think if you looked at Tin's profile, you will see a lot more of these when he is not speaking with Lovero and than when he is. This, of course, doesn't take anything away from their accomplishments, and I'm very happy for them to have achieved what they have. But I think he's definitely good. Otherwise, they would have not achieved what they have. He can deliver a load of content, and he can deliver it well. I think that like common sense and intuition. I think I've mentioned that too many times already in this podcast. Is something I strongly appreciated in speakers, and something which I did not see, or at least he did not demonstrate throughout most instances where I saw him speaking, particularly when he was not speaking with Lovro.
Well, there you have it, everyone. The best answer so far with the real stuff, with a bunch of examples.
What, is everyone else doing this politely with a million caveats?
Yes,
I mean,
most people are.
Look, all of the above mentioned are good speakers. I don't take that away from them, but I just don't think they are as good as people consider them to be. They're still top-notch debaters. They're just not like GOAT material or even close to that.
But that's part of it, right? So you have to be a good speaker to be overrated. You have to be actually rated.
Yeah. Yes.
And rarely it is the case that someone is absolutely terrible and they are actually rated. You have to still win some rounds to do that. Okay. Great.
By the way, Nikki, before that, I think going into the underrated category, there's one person I wasn't entirely sure whether to put there, which is Ayal, because he is good, but and I think he was a massive contribution to that Tel Aviv team. I am just not sure to which extent he is underrated. I think people did appreciate his contribution. I think he definitely contributed as much to the team as Dan did. I just think in terms of delivery, he perhaps was not as effective at it as Dan was. So, but I still think people appreciate his contributions. I think many of the things he did afterwards also also indicate that. So I think he is, I guess, an honorable mention in the underrated category because I don't think people like disregard him entirely, but they certainly. I think the perception of the gap between the two is higher than it ought to be. The gap is, still exists, but it's just not as big as people think it is.
Or at their peak, 2018 Worlds, one speaker point difference
Yeah.
throughout
So
9
yeah.
rounds. So you
Sorry, I
take
guess
it
not.
as this. So like, I definitely think he's underrated just because of like how we remember that team throughout history,
Yeah.
and obviously Dan Lahaf. I mean, again, you're rated because you're good. So there's that. So greatest debaters of all time, and I want 3 categories from you: of all time, of Balkan debaters, and of Serbian debaters.
All right. Let's go for of all time. Now, look, I'll answer the questions, of course. I think the one struggle I have, and the one caveat I have to make is I think a lot of good speakers, especially your top notch, your GOAT candidate, would be able to adjust the speaking styles in different eras. So, what you needed to do in order to be a good debater in 2010 was different than what you needed to do in 2015 and was different than what you needed to do in 2020. This makes the comparison slightly tricky because you're making hypotheticals on whether people would be able to adjust or not, or you might be thinking who was just the best within the framework which existed at that point in time, right? That's the tricky thing because debating is inherently subjective. This being said, I think the probably the best way I will answer this is to like take a number of people from those different eras up until the point when I was active. And let me list a few names and then I'll try my best to rank them. I would say if you go up until 2010, 11, that's Shengwu Li. And there, I think that's like the easiest one. Like, I mean, sure, like if you from hindsight look at some of his speeches, some of the analysis is not as robust as you perhaps may expect nowadays. But if you compare him with not the average speaker of the era, but like other speakers you would run into in those exact same like top level rooms or like last out rounds, there is just a massive gap in quality, which you can see. And some of the influences and the style you feel in debating today from like the more analytical thinking, I think pretty much come from him. Also, Jonathan Leader Maynard, who, while not as noted, deserves a mention as well. If you proceed more onwards, and to me, this is like, I think one thing I will say unequivocally, what I consider the greatest debating team of all time, even though they were very together for a very short time and don't have a major title behind them, is Ansar Aftab and Ashish Kumar in Manchester Euros. Like this team was exceptional, and both of these speakers were exceptionally good at what they did. I think also, yeah, even I forgot about Answer. Answer is massively underrated. He is such a good speaker with such a big level of versatility that had he cared more about debating, he could have easily been like a top level contender for the gold title. For a similar reason, because of very few data points, I'll go for Ashish. Ashish also he has achievements to his name, but he also wasn't in debating super long. I think the way he was able to articulate arguments, analyze stuff, and also I can testify as someone who had the privilege of speaking with him once. The amount of creativity this person has is unparalleled in any other top level speaker I've seen. I mean, the reason why he probably won't make top number one overall uh, is because uh, he sometimes lacked content. And then you, of course, get Harish. Harish is a bit difficult because he's a dinosaur, but not only a dinosaur, but also because he's been in debating for so long. And his style has evolved a lot. Like, I mean, he started speaking university level, and if I recall correctly, it was 2007, 2008. He finished in 2016. In terms of competitive level of speaking, that's more than anyone else. But his influence on debating, I think, was by far the largest of any other individual speakers I can mention. Now, beyond this, issue is like I can't put Lahab on the list because I haven't seen him in detail at his prime. So, like, if you and your listeners give me the excuse of saying like up to when I was actively involved, 2017, he was very good. He was exceptionally good. Probably already at that point in time the best ESL speaker ever. Not sufficient evidence based on which I can conclude a GOAT. So, and then beyond that, I know there's a couple of good speakers that popped up, but I don't really have evidence. So, like, bear with me. I'm giving you GOAT up until 2017. Now, if I was to rank the people I indicated, which are Shengwu, Ashish, and Harish, I would probably rank them Harish, Shengwu, Ashish. Reason for this being comparable quality. Harish has demonstrated most versatility of the three mentioned in adjusting to different periods and styles of debating. This is number one. Number two, he has influenced the way in which debating has evolved more than anyone else has. So a lot of this really explicit focus on analyzing and proving your points and de-emphasizing style, even though he's stylistically pretty solid, does come from him. Like most of the judging guides are based on most of the judging guides from 20 what was it 2015 no sorry 2014 from are based on what he wrote for Chennai Worlds onwards. And I mean in terms of accomplishments, if I recall correctly, there's a Euros title, there is two Worlds finals, there is a Worlds semi and a Worlds quarter. It is more than enough to claim this. In terms of number two, that's Shengwu because he has more accomplishments than Ashish was in for a longer time. That's simply it. But why is he not number one? Because this sort of demonstrates like versatility over different periods and styles of speaking. I just see more of it in Harish. They may have both been very good in their eras. You can make the argument that Shengwu dominated his more than Harish dominated his, but Harish's era was significantly more competitive than Shengwu's was. So yeah, there you go.
So one
I
interesting
think
note,
a similar to, by interesting observation is like all you can see the influence of the style that influenced me. Like all three are Oxbridge speakers, so you can see also notes of like where I picked up my speaking from, and that might also color this bias.
no mention of MDG.
MDG is very, very good and very, very solid. I mean, I had the privilege of speaking with him. I think he was very good at expressing himself. He had very strong argumentation. There were not that many moments where I could point to a speech of his and be, this is absolutely mind blowing. One exception being when I fucked up our Euros semi-final and I had a really bad speech. He managed to pull off one of the best whips I've ever seen, if not the best one, and take content which existed, bits and pieces of it, but was never operationalized it, and use it to get us a second. So that I will never forget, partly because he would have most likely never forgiven me had we not gone through. But that is the one single instance. I think, I mean, if you were to make me make a list of the top 10, he's definitely there, very possibly on the edge of the top 5. I think also if I was to compare him with Ashish, it's difficult for me to come up with a justification as to why he is better than Ashish, other than potentially the analytical part. And then obviously by that law, right? I can't rank him above number 2. But yeah, I mean, other honorable mentions. You'll get MDG there. You will have Lahav. You will have Josh Zoffer. You will have Chris Bissett, Jonathan Leader Maynard. You could also make the argument for like Mubarak along those lines as well. So there's definitely speakers who are very good. I just don't consider GOAT contenders.
No women in the list also.
That is a byproduct of the era, right? If you looked at World's finals during my era, I'm not like during the time I was actively speaking. All right, there was a female in the 2015 finals, but I would say it was 80-90% men. It is a product of an activity that does have its problems with sexism. It still does. It particularly had them at that time. You had a speaker who was catcalled during the finals of the Glasgow Ancients back in 2014. Absolutely appalling things. But look, I will not compromise for whom I consider best just to adjust for gender balance. They were exceptional female speakers, but due to external factors, they have not performed as well as some men have. That is an unfortunate fact of life, but that's not a reason to compromise the GOATs list.
That's a fair answer. I had to ask the tough questions that people are asking from our audience. On Balkan debaters and Serbian debaters, are you the GOAT?
There's two perspectives you can take on this. The short answer is I would say most likely Milos Marjanovic is the GOAT in terms of objective results and influence and also style. I think he does almost everything I do well as good as I do. And he does some other things a lot better than I ever did. Now, to be fair, I haven't seen you or Rumen speaking over the last year, which I understand is your prime. So again, this goes with the previous caveat, right? I'm aware of things up until 2017. I am somewhat aware of what's happening until 2020. After 2020, my knowledge of debating gets really patchy. So I don't have any evidence. I know you guys did well on Tab, but you know yourself, right? You can't make an assumption on how good someone is purely based on Tab. So I'll caveat you out of this. I guess despite what I said before, your close second is Tin. Despite what I said about him being overrated, there is still enough objective accomplishments there that it would be stupid of you to ignore them. And he does have a strong track record. Now, admittedly, you can make the argument if someone is overrated, part of the reason they'll perform well at international comps is rep. And rep boost is the thing that has remained consistent. So obviously I can't control for that, and I also don't know whether that's true or not. But you cannot ignore to recognize the achievements of someone who is the first ESL speaker, one of the first two ESL speakers to win worlds and is from our region. I think ultimately reason why I rank Milos there is even though he hasn't won worlds, I mean, he has a complete list of CA ships. He has a long list of tournaments he has won. And also, I just think fundamentally as a speaker, he is analytically on par. His refutation is better. And he has a stronger common sense. Also, I also feel here, you can draw parallels between this team of Milos and Janko and Lovro and Tin. As in, you also had the second speaker who was perhaps not as good as expressing themselves, but had this strong intuition for what are the right and wrong things to run and was very good at framing. So I think to some extent, you can draw parallels between these two teams. I'll go with Milos, but you can make the argument for Tin. I have caveated the two of you out, and then obviously this also answers your question about Serbian debating. Now there, if you want to go to ranking, there is an interesting discussion to be had in terms of how you rank Janko and myself, right? All right, if we accept that Milos is number one, there is this separate discussion. Janko also has a World's Finals, which is an achievement more than I do, but doesn't have as many international titles, but also has, I think, either the Oxford or the Cambridge IB, which is also important, and I think I don't have.
Oxford.
So that's That's the thing I am not entirely clear on. But I will close on one final important point when it comes to Serbian debating. Uh, I mean, to some extent, it matters to Balkans debating, and to an even lesser to global debating. If you think about an activity like debating, one way to think about the GOAT is who is the best in terms of whatever is like your abstract idea of intrinsics as well as results, and some sort of vague weighing of the two. The other way to think about GOATs is to think about how much better they were for the era they were in. And that's why Shengwu features very highly on this list. There is a third way to think about them, which is in terms of their overall legacy and the impact they had on the activity, especially considering it's not like football where we count the number of goals, or tennis where we count the number of days you were or weeks you were number one, or the number of Grand Slams you won. It's a lot more inherently subjective, which makes the whole legacy point a lot more important. And this is where I throw a bone to Janko and Milos, where I say, look, if you look at my legacy and what came after me, in part, I'm by the way, I'm in no means claiming that their achievements are a result of what I did or the coaching I helped with them. It has contributed to some extent, but it's predominantly theirs achievement that they should be proud of it. But their achievements do have a bit of a contribution from me. My question is, what is their legacy going to be?
Well, look, I think in terms of legacy, it's by far, by a mile, Milos is the GOAT. I think if you look at this conversation 5 years from now, this is going to be even more true. I think it's connected to general impact on different circuits and debaters from these circuits in terms of like personal advice, types of coaching, etc. I think this is a topic that we can go too much on. But it's an interesting conversation to have maybe some other time, maybe on a panel. We'll see.
Agreed. I'll just add one thing here. Yeah, I forgot about Milos's impact on societies around. So yeah, I'll definitely grant him that. I even call him, like, this will matter for your Balkan viewers. He's the Alexander Vucic of Serbian debating, and they can take out from that whatever they wish. But yeah, I think this point still applies for Janko.
That's absolutely fair. One interesting question that you kind of alluded to, and I think it's gonna be a good one to finish this off on. So you haven't watched me and Roman, I suppose, especially in the semifinals of Worlds. It is connected to the overall thing that we have in debating on, like, has liberal bias gone too far? That particular round motion is this house regrets the I think liberal dominance in Western universities. We are CG on that motion. Roman goes off in a particular way. We have a very hardcore right-wing case, if you can call it like that. Some things on abortion have been said, on Bernie Sanders being the devil and things like that. It's all recorded. Maybe sometimes you can have fun with it. But in the grand scheme of things, it's more of an outlier than the norm. So how would you comment on liberal bias in debating, and what were some moments when you think it went too far? Do you think it's going to have a problematic impact on debating overall over time, or do you think it's always going to be something that just exists there but is going to be counterbalanced by people who are not necessarily that much on the left?
All right, it's a good question. Let me say a couple of things. First and foremost, debating has been and is a reflection of norms you see in higher education, and in particular, the more liberal aspects of it. You see, in terms of no platforming and speech rules in many Western universities, that, in my opinion, it has gone too far. And there are plenty of examples here, which you will know many of, so I don't want to go through them. So obviously, debating is going to be a reflection of that. And as fatalist as this sounds, I do not think that is likely to change anytime soon. I think it will continue on these lines. And I think you have seen demonstrated effects of this throughout the years. Uh, and these are very tangible. And I think it is going to get worse, to be perfectly frank with you. This isn't just like, there's this guy on your podcast holding center right views who's bitching about the liberal agenda. No, no, no. It translates into very tangible things, right? Let me share a few examples going throughout the years. 2014, you get a top down implementation of gender pronouns at Euros, which pisses us off. And to clarify, we are not pissed off by gender pronouns. We are pissed off that there was no discussion on this, and then a Oxbridge debater, who, to the best of my understanding, identifies as non-binary, threatens to boycott Euros and makes a scene at council over a thing that was never discussed in continental Europe before. And then you get people like me and many others going like, what the fuck are these stupid gender pronouns? Whereas, has someone actually taken the time to talk with us about this, like, very, at that point in time, insular Iona issue, especially as we have no third gender in many of our languages, or a non-gendered term, like the Serbian term for, like, someone who's not male and female would be a term you use to refer to an object, like it. And then, like, I get this, like, person yelling and making a scene and pushing top down norms is the kind of thing which annoys you, to say the slightest. I think more broadly, right, some impacts of this. Number one, like, there were scenes when people set a motion that related to abortion at the Oxford IV, I believe, in 2016. And I mean, it is a pertinent issue today. Obviously, you can't, I think at this point in time, you can't set a motion along the lines of banning abortion at all stages of pregnancy as you did back in 2009. But there are still relevant motions. Like, for instance, the one that triggered people and was ultimately a big deal was having women only vote in referendas related to abortion issues, which doesn't even require you to take a stance on whether abortion should be legal or not. It's a more legalistic debate, but even these things are getting outside of the spectrum and are not discussed. Or like any motions which touch on racial profiling, people complain about this, like, because, like, oh, they were once racially profiled. I mean, this is the one thing that annoys me, right? I was bombed when I was 7 years old. Does this mean we shouldn't have motions about war? And let me not even get started on, like, what many of the Israeli debaters have gone through. So that sort of thing actively narrows down the space of things which you can discuss. And then it goes to the next level, right? You had what happened in the finals of Worlds in Johannesburg, but also Cape Town. Cape Town, where you had people, because of issues which were not strictly related to the competition, disrupt the finals. And then you had other sorts of speech policing, which this frequently leads to, where the finals of Thailand Worlds has been deleted and half the tab redacted because it insulted China. So, like, accepting this sort of redacting from both sides is a fundamental issue. I think also, like, some competition in the United States, perhaps I think the North American Championships, had a sit-in again for similar reasons. So it's not just me complaining about a liberal bias. It's the fact that its existence is narrowing down the discussion space within debating and making it insular to many ways a lot of other university activities in the West are becoming. Now, for better or for worse, the mindset in debating has always been what is the left wing of the day. I don't have an issue with this per se. What I think is the more frustrating thing is the lack of accommodation for non-standard, or if you will, non-left-wing arguments within debates. Like especially 2016 onward, just post, or 2015 onward, just post Sally Rooney, there was this automatic assumption on intersectionality. Every single debate is about the most vulnerable group, which intersects with the most vulnerable group. And sure, debating is partly about that. It is about members of society impacted the most or those who are most vulnerable. But it's not entirely about that. And that is the thing that frustrates me. On one hand, like not accepting that a lot of debates can be debated from a non-standard mindset. And secondly, allowing this atmosphere of broader speech policing, which exists in many universities, especially in the Anglo-Saxon world more than anywhere else, to significantly constrain the creativity that can be displayed within this activity. I mean, at one point in time, there was a discussion whether motions should have trigger warnings in them, which I found a bit ridiculous.
Do you think that we're at a point of our community where we can say we've accommodated to a large degree the existence of different identities so that now we're in a better position to allow for a more diverse spectrum of arguments on the left and on the right?
No.
No? Elaborate?
Sure. So, I mean, this inevitably devolves into a political tirade. So let me try to avoid that as much as possible. While I respect a lot of the work the left has done towards inclusion of certain groups, I think to many extents, a lot of that, especially in the preceding half a decade, has necessarily involved a variant which disallows for the questioning of anything which might touch upon identities for the purpose of protecting the sanctity of those identities. Let me respond with a question. Nikki, could you set a motion on making all sports open categories or disallowing trans females to participate in women-only competitions without this causing an uproar on the internet or on Facebook?
I agree. You probably can't. But my question is, shouldn't it be like that? If we've come a long way from making the debate community fairly inclusive, which I think it is, obviously, I'm sure like maybe I come from a privileged position. Some people say there are other structural problems. Obviously, those are always going to be existing. But my question is more hypothetical for the future. Aren't we now ready to revisit some of these conversations? Because we know that inherently we have equity officers, we have so many people involved into these competitions. So it's not a question of whether it ought to be this way, but rather can it become this way because we've gone so much on the left. So we've kind of covered a lot of the protections that people on the left believe should happen. So now that we have these protections, isn't it a good time to start revisiting these conversations in debating?
You can't do it because it's one of the fundamental tenets of identity politics. One of the tenets of identity politics is that identities are not called into question because it is just too harmful for certain individuals, especially those who may have shifted identities or insecure in their identities, to have those called into question. The result of that is that a lot of speech simply cannot be had. Consequently, a lot of topics cannot be opened. And if you open them, according to this perspective, you are harming the identities of those groups. So this is, perhaps where the crux of the issue I have is. It is the logical conclusion of identity politics that certain things cannot be discussed. Therefore, you cannot debate them. So if you reopen that, from their perspective, you are regressing. And we are going back where we were 5 years ago. Because the point and the end goal should be that people's identities are in no way, even tangentially or hypothetically, brought into question.
So according to you, we cannot escape this. There's
No, it's
no
only going to
turning
get
back.
worse. It's only going to get worse.
Okay.
I mean, worse. For some people, it's going to be better. I mean, if I can get more relativist here, like debating is whatever most of the people in it want it to be. The vast majority in it are left wing. They are slightly less represented at the top echelons of debating. I will leave you to make your conclusions on why this is the case, but there's simply no way around it.
Do you think there is a sense of wanting to prove something more because you're a right-wing debater in a left-wing debate society?
I mean, for me, it was definitely useful because there are instances, particularly when emotion touches on econ, where you can explore these topics as long as you're careful with wording. And then, like, if you're explicit on impacting and you have a good judge, which is something I benefited from when I started experimenting with those sorts of things. And I also didn't run those sorts of arguments before I had an established reputation and was mostly hitting top rooms. You are able to do it. But this brings us back to like that discussion we had an hour and a half ago. If you're in your middle room with your mediocre to bad judge, these things will not fly because they're used to whatever is the mantra of the day. And this most certainly is not the mantra of the day. It's an outlier. And like applying an external perspective on it, weighing it for rigidity, some judges simply don't have the cojones to do it.
Oh, there you have it. We're fucked. This is it. There's no going back. It's doomsday. Debating is bad. I'm joking, of course.
It's not doomsday. It's going to be like the liberal wet dream for 95% of people. And ultimately, it is a democracy. So most people will get what they wanted. You and I might complain about this. Rumen might complain about this. Yanko will complain about this. Harish will, but he'll do it in a British way. But it is what it is.
It is what it is indeed. I will conclude this by saying if we think about the average informed voter, the real average informed voter, it is likely that at least 50% of them are not left wing. Just think for thought. There's many things to be discussed. Siri, thank you very much. This was very fun. It was great to have this conversation with you. You have been an inspiration for a lot of people, even though sometimes you can be an asshole, but that makes you more interesting, in my opinion. So there it is. You heard it from one of the best. So that's that concludes the longest podcast so far. So yeah.
Thanks for having me, Nikki. It was a pleasure to share some of the old stories and like also reflect and recollect like some of the things even I forgot. So thanks for the invite and really good idea to have this podcast.
Thank you.